You're listening to Medscape's In Discussion series on psoriasis, a podcast where thought leaders and clinical experts share their diverse insights and practical ideas for optimizing patient care. This series is hosted by Dr. Stephen R. Feldman, editor of the Journal of Dermatological Treatment and professor of dermatology at the Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Relevant disclosures can be found with the episode show notes on medscape.com or the Medscape app. The topics and discussions are planned, produced, and reviewed independently of advertisers. This podcast is intended only for U.S. healthcare professionals.
Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Feldman. Welcome to Medscape's In Discussion series on psoriasis. This is the second episode of our fourth season. Today we'll discuss oral agents in development for the treatment of psoriasis. Our guest expert is a board-certified dermatologist and clinical researcher practicing in San Francisco, California, where she is CEO of Synergy Dermatology. In addition to seeing patients, she's an associate clinical professor in the Department of Dermatology at the University of California, San Francisco, and a member of the National Psoriasis Foundation's Scientific Advisory Committee and Medical Advisory Board. It's my pleasure to present Dr. Tina Bhutani. Tina, welcome to In Discussion.
Thank you for having me, Steve. I'm so excited to be here.
That's great. All right. Well, we've got all kinds of developments in the world of psoriasis over the past couple of decades. We're going to focus today on oral treatments. Let's start with some of the things we were using, say, before the year 2000, maybe before you were even doing psoriasis.
No, I think, when I started, I remember, I trained with Dr. John Koo, and when I was in clinic with him, we would use a lot of methotrexate, acitretin, even some cyclosporin occasionally for those erythrodermic, really severe cases. So in some ways, we were using a lot of orals because we didn't have biologics at that point in time.
Super. And so do you still use these medications?
A little bit. I think, the only times I'm using methotrexate is really when access is an issue. I think at this point, if I can get a patient a more modern oral or a biologic, I try to lean in that direction. I still use acitretin sometimes for patients with pustular diseases, hand foot psoriasis. I find it works a little bit better. So there's still a role for these older drugs.
In the last few years, we've had a couple new orals come out.
Yeah, so we have apremilast, which now has been around for a little while. That, I think, was our first entry into more of like these modern oral agents. And I think it was really popular amongst patients and dermatologists for a really long time. It didn't require any lab monitoring. It was pretty safe as far as, serious adverse events goes. It had some tolerability issues, or it has some tolerability issues like GI discomfort and, nausea, diarrhea, things like that. Many patients were happy with it at the time. Again, I think our treatments have continued to evolve, but at the time apremilast came out, it was definitely a popular option for patients. And then a few years later, we got deucravacitinib or Sotyktu, which we have, been using in our clinics. Superior to apremilast as far as efficacy goes. There was head-to-head trials showing superiority to Otezla, and it didn't have as many of the tolerability issues that we had with apremilast. And so I think that was more recently what we've been using a little bit more of in our clinic.
Apremilast, I think, is now available as a once-a-day formulation.
Once a day, they have an extended release. So the original formulation, I think, was 30 milligrams twice daily, and now they have a 75 milligram extended release form. So you can just take it once daily. So that is really nice. The other thing, nice thing about apremilast is that it is indicated for mild, moderate, and severe psoriasis. So it doesn't matter what your psoriasis severity is. You can really give apremilast to anyone who's failing topicals, is ready to take that next step without having to fudge the numbers in your chart. You can actually be honest about the body surface area and everything involved. Because, many of the medications that are indicated for moderate to severe psoriasis, oftentimes the insurance companies or the payers are looking for that quote unquote 10% body surface area number. But with apremilast, we don't have to worry about that. It's indicated for all severities of psoriasis.
I get the sense, well, a couple of things. One, that insurers might prove it down to 5% body surface areas being moderate to severe.
Yeah.
Certainly if there's face, genital, palm, and sole involvement, that might help us get things covered.
Exactly. Apremilast is also approved for psoriatic arthritis. So again, if your patient might have that sometimes, also helps. And, talking to my rheumatology colleagues, I think it's a decent option for psoriatic arthritis. So that's oftentimes a place where we will use it as well. Deucravacitinib is not officially approved for psoriatic arthritis just yet, but I think they are hopefully going to get that indication in the next year. And the data there looks promising as well. It does look superior to apremilast and effective for psoriatic arthritis.
When patients are wondering, should I go with this old oral or this one of these newfangled injection medicines?
Yeah.
I tell them that the chance of getting a really good, solid response with something like apremilast is about 1/3 the chance that you're going to get there with one of the best injection
Yeah.
medicines.
Yeah. That's exactly what I tell my patients. I said there's a 30% chance that you're going to be really, really happy on this medication. Whereas, with the biologics, it's closer to probably 80-90% chance that you'll be really happy. So the injections do work better, but it's still, I think, scary for many patients to take a shot, even though it's the smallest needle in medicine. I always tell them, we have these auto injector pens. You're not going to see it. You're not going to see the needle. But I think people just still feel a little bit more comfortable with oral drugs. I think there's a lot of stigma around injectable drugs, and it makes your disease seem more serious. And the fact that they might have to continue on these injections lifelong also is a scary option for them. I feel like they feel like they're less likely to be able to stop it versus an oral. They could just kind of stop it one day and decide not to take it anymore. So I think those are all the things that go into kind of the psychology behind injectable versus orals from a patient's perspective.
I think I heard you say that you're using a lot more deucravacitinib now than apremilast.
Yeah, that has been my practice over the last few years, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like twice as effective.
Isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And we also have data showing it works well in special sites, like you mentioned, scalp, genital, palms and soles. So those are areas where I like to use deucravacitinib as well.
And I recently heard that the company that makes it is no longer promoting it.
They're no longer promoting it in dermatology, which is sad, but the medication still exists. The support programs are still out there. We're just not going to have the reps coming into our offices, and we're not going to have samples most likely. So it's unfortunate. They still are going to keep their rheumatology team. So I think, if you really need support, you probably can reach out to someone in your area. But yeah, that was surprising to hear.
I presume it's because, unlike you, a lot of dermatologists weren't prescribing it very often. What do you
Yeah.
think was going on there?
I think when deucravacitinib first came out, it's a TYK2 inhibitor, and TYK2 is in the family of JAK inhibitors. It doesn't have the black box warning like our JAK inhibitors in atopic dermatitis, but I think at the time it came out, we were talking about that black box warning in other diseases. And so I think a lot of it is just it got lumped together with these JAK inhibitors, and there was this fear at the time of prescribing these drugs, and was it going to cause blood clots or cardiovascular disease or infections? And now we know that in our dermatology population, we haven't seen that pan out with the JAK inhibitors. But unfortunately, I think it got labeled early on as a JAK inhibitor. And like I said, with the apremilast, no lab monitoring, really no serious safety issues. It was really easy to prescribe that drug and use it. You could literally just hand the patient a sample pack in their clinic and they could get started. You don't have to do a TB test. And these were things that, so TYK2, you don't have to do extensive lab monitoring, but you should be doing a TB test before you start it.
Yeah. So the deucravacitinib, twice as effective, don't have the nausea, don't have the diarrhea, don't have the headaches, and they couldn't sell.
Well, yeah, it's surprising to me, to be completely honest. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, my impression was the one real different side effect wise with deucravacitinib was, in terms of the mechanism, psoriasis to me is this interleukin-23 TYK2 IL-17 axis. So you're actually targeting the
Exactly.
psoriasis axis, but that the effect of blocking TYK2 could also affect interferons, which could predispose to some herpetic infections. Is that a potential greater risk with deucravacitinib than apremilast?
It's a slightly greater risk. They did see, a small number of patients getting herpes infections or herpes zoster infections, but I don't think it was significant enough that it was inhibiting me to prescribe the drug. And I never heard, out there when I'm giving talks and things like that, I didn't really hear that as a concern from many people. But yes, that is a potential. There is a small increased risk of those herpes infections.
Yeah, I was having people get vaccinated for shingles just to, if they were willing before starting that.
Yeah.
Well, this leads us to the new drugs in development, which we really need to focus on today. Why don't we start? We're already talking TYK2. Why don't we talk about TYK2 drugs?
Yeah, so a few drugs in development. I think the one that's farthest along is zasocitinib. Again, it's showing a really high efficacy, really quick improvement. I think the evolution of oral agents is really going to be shown in these newer drugs. I always say, as our new iPhones technology improves every year, so be it with our with our drugs that we use. And so again, we're seeing quicker onset, we're seeing better efficacy and also pretty good tolerability. Again, we need to see the phase 3, the larger studies and data there. And of course, real world is always where we want to know how this drug works. But so far, zasocitinib shows very promising results across the board.
How do you feel it compares to deucravacitinib?
They are doing a head-to-head study. We'll see how that works.
If deucravacitinib does have a real increased risk of herpetic infections because you're blocking interferon,
Okay.
this newer one, zasocitinib, if it's blocking TYK2 better and giving you greater efficacy, faster improvement than we get with deucravacitinib, are we expecting that we're going to see even more issues with viruses?
It's an interesting question. I think we don't have the specific answer yet. My thought is we might see similar herpes infections and viral infections that we see with deucravacitinib, but I don't know if it'll necessarily be greater. That's something that I think we'll have to see. Zasocitinib is very specific for TYK2, and so again, I think that's going to be very, very interesting to see how the adverse event profile pans out for that drug.
My impression, I try to remember the PASI 75 rates for these different drugs, and I think the Tanacept is being maybe 50% for, and adalimumab maybe 60, ustekinumab 70, secukinumab 80, and then the others, like, we're getting in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
got the impression that deucravacitinib was in the adalimumab range, maybe. That maybe adalimumab works a little better at first, but because of anti-drug antibodies, it kind of tails off. And how do you think the zasocitinib fits on that scale?
I think we're going to be getting closer to, the ustekinumab, maybe even secukinumab numbers. And I think that is the goal with these newer oral agents, right, is to get closer to the efficacy of the biologic drugs with an oral route of administration. So I think that is the ultimate goal. But we do have to balance that with safety and tolerability, which is an issue sometimes with the oral drugs.
I was amazed at the effectiveness of IL-17 drugs. When etanercept hit the market, I was like, I'm never going to see another quantum leap forward like this again. But then adalimumab, a different TNF inhibitor, came out that was more effective. Then ustekinumab came out, which was at least as effective, maybe a little more, especially in the long run, and safer.
Yeah.
And these IL-23 drugs came out. Remember when my former partner, Alan Fleischer, came to me after doing IL-17 studies, and he is a little cynical kind of guy. And I remember him saying, I've never seen anything like it before. I give them this drug and their psoriasis just disappears.
Quickly, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So now I understand we may have an oral IL-17 drug on the way.
Yeah, I think it's a little farther along in development. I mean, it'll take a little bit longer than zasocitinib or some of these newer oral IL-23 drugs, but we do have oral IL-17 drugs also in development. And so I think again, yeah, if we can see that quick efficacy by blocking anti-IL-17, but put it in an oral option and get it pretty close to, some of those biologics, I definitely think it's an option that patients will consider.
One of the things I think a lot of dermatologists believe is that interleukin 17 drugs are better for the joints than maybe some of the other biologic options. Are you thinking that these oral IL-17s will get into the joint better than a big old antibody would and maybe be particularly helpful for psoriatic arthritis?
That's a great question, and I hope that is the case. I think there is some thought that penetration to those smaller joints, especially, peripheral joints, might be a little bit better with oral drugs. And again, I think that might tell us why, for example, drugs like apremilast, even though in the skin they don't do all that well, in the joints, apremilast actually does pretty decently, or sometimes, even comparable to some of the biologics. And so it's possible that with these oral drugs, we could see better efficacy in those joints than the skin.
One thing that kind of leads me not to use IL-17 drugs as much as I would otherwise, more than anything else, not the candidiasis. It's the IBD, the inflammatory bowel disease risk of these drugs. I mean, people thought, oh, if a drug works for psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, it's going to work for inflammatory bowel disease too. And they tried biologics that block IL-17 and they didn't make IBD better. They made IBD worse.
Yeah.
And now we're talking about putting the anti-IL-17 right into the colon. Should we be nervous about that?
Yeah, I think, it's a potential. I think for me, the hardest thing is that with IBD, oftentimes patients don't have a family history. They don't have any other indication that they are at higher risk for developing IBD. And sometimes we only find it once we start patients on one of these medications. Luckily, I haven't seen too much of it, having used a lot of the IL-17 inhibitors. But I think there is a true possibility there. I think potentially what might happen is that the IBD will show up earlier, maybe with the oral IL-17 agents as they did with the biologics, but I don't know necessarily if it's going to be any more severe or problematic. But I think it's going to be one of those things if your patient shows symptoms, you just stop the drug immediately. And the nice thing about the oral drugs is they have quick half-lives, right? So they're out of your system a little bit quicker than, for example, the injectable IL-17s that are going to stay in your system for a little longer. So the patients might have to live with the symptoms for longer. So in some ways, it could be a benefit.
So you see, you haven't seen much IBD. Have you seen any IBD in
I
that?
have seen some IBD. I have seen a couple of cases of IBD.
Yeah.
One was never confirmed IBD, but I think it was highly suspicious for IBD. And then another one was a true onset of Crohn's disease in a patient who was started on an IL-17 inhibitor.
Today, before we get any of these new orals, my idea of the gold standard is IL-23 blockade. I mean, it is so effective
Yeah.
and so safe, but it's given by injection. Is an oral IL-23 like the holy grail?
I think so. Yeah. I think not only are IL-23s, effective, but safety has been really, really key with the IL-23s. We really haven't seen any issues, no IBD, no candidiasis. You really don't have to ask many questions when you're starting patients on an IL-23 inhibitor. They also have a really great durability, right? So we see IL-23 inhibitors, unlike some of our, previous biologics, they don't tend to lose efficacy over time. They tend to retain that efficacy. And so that's really nice for patients when they don't have to keep switching their drugs. So yes, I think an oral IL-23 would be the holy grail, and hopefully soon it will be. We have icotrokinra, which is in development, probably the next oral that we will have in our toolbox. I think it's the farthest in development. Hopefully next year we should have that approved. Again, showing efficacy pretty close to some of our more modern biologics, or getting closer, I should say. Again, I think we're looking at more of like that secukinumab family of PASI 75 with these oral agents. So again, if I can get somebody secukinumab-like efficacy with an oral drug with really good safety and tolerability, like what I would expect with an IL-23, if I gave that option to patients, I think they would jump for the opportunity.
It's interesting that the oral IL-23, you're getting that 80% range efficacy, not the 90% that you get for the injectable IL-23s. And
Yeah.
this is going to sound crazy. I think patients may not be fully adherent to their oral treatment.
That's exactly. I think you could tell us about that, Steve.
I just wonder if they actually took it every day like they were supposed to, maybe they would get
Yeah.
that 90% efficacy.
Yeah. And I think that's what's going to be really key to look at is the real world data, because in clinical trials, these patients are more likely to probably be, taking the drugs. They're having their visits more frequently. And you've taught us, right? If you're coming into the doctor, they're more likely to take their medication. And also, the one thing with icotrokinra is designed to be taken on an empty stomach to maximize the efficacy of the drug. And so patients, have to be fasting, take it first thing in the morning with water. In the real world, I think that's going to be tricky, right? I think we're going to eat our breakfast, you're going to forget, and then you might take the medication a little later. So we'll have to see how the real world efficacy really matches up with the clinical trial efficacy.
Hopefully we'll see it get into the joints well. And in contrast to the oral IL-17, I just love the idea of oral IL-23 because I imagine the GI doctors are going to be in their heyday with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always know, in GI, they oftentimes use higher doses. And so again, they could probably really push the limits with this drug, given the so far what we see is a very positive safety profile and tolerability profile.
Super. Is there anything else you think we should let our listeners know?
No, I think, don't be afraid to use some of these newer agents. I think it's an exciting time for our psoriasis patients, and we really need to be giving them the full toolbox.
Super. And that reminds me that you're so active in our National Psoriasis Foundation that if patients are asking us, where can they get more information, going to psoriasis.org.
Yes.
The National Psoriasis Foundation website is probably a great place to go.
Yeah, one of my favorite places. We know there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. And so with psoriasis.org, you know that you're going to get legitimate information. There's even one-page handouts about each of the drugs, so you can hand those to your patients in your clinic. It's a really nice way to get them really legitimate, evidence-based information.
Super. Well, today we've talked to Dr. Tina Bhutani about oral agents in development for the treatment of psoriasis. We've seen that the older agents still probably have some place, acitrin for people with pustular diseases, and the apremilast so easy to use. But some of these new agents in development seem like they're going to yet be one more quantum leap forward for our patients. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Steve Feldman for In Discussion.
Thanks for listening to Medscape's In Discussion Psoriasis podcast series with our host, Dr. Stephen R. Feldman. Be sure to look for more In Discussion episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Check out medscape.com or the Medscape app for show notes, links, and more information on psoriasis.